The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this episode are that of the guest and host and do not necessarily reflect the values of sponsors or other associated organizations. Welcome to the Parental Compass by Family Education and Support Services. I'm your host, Bobby Williams. Subscribe to the show. Any platform lets you do it. We'll notify you each week when the episode drops. Addiction is extremely prevalent in our society. It's not something you would want for your child. There's a lot of risk factors out there. Some of them aren't as obvious as you would think. Our guest today is a writer for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and author of the best-selling book, The Addiction Inoculation, Jessica Lahey. Jessica has had her own challenges with addiction and has spent years researching this issue. Jessica releases daily videos on preventing addiction. They're only 90 seconds long. You can find them on Instagram at Teacher Lahey, or on TikTok at Jess Lahey, or go to jessicalahey.com for more information. Jessica has some amazing ideas. Let's get into it. You take a very hard line on no drinking until you're 21. What about like the European model of like, let them drink a little, and then by the time they turn 21, they'll be more ready and prepared, and it's less of a shock?
Well, it's funny when you say I take a hard line. I think I take my guidance from the research. So, the nice thing, I have basically the coolest job in the world, which is to get curious about a topic, research the heck out of it for a couple of years, be as objective as possible. I happen to be married to a statistician, so that helps. He helps me with, anything, the studies. And, I came out of those 2 years that I spent doing the deep research for prevention science for drug and alcohol, for substance use disorder. And where the evidence comes out, it's really, really clear that parents that have a consistent and clear message of no, not until, whether you want to say not until it's legal for you, or from my perspective, what's more important is not until your brain is done developing. Those parents have kids with much, much lower levels of substance use disorder. And so and then the problem with the European thing is there's a couple of arguments I get. Well, what about the European thing? I thought it was important to introduce my kids to alcohol so that they don't go crazy when suddenly it's around and they, blah, blah, blah. And the theory there is that somehow we can teach kids moderation. And for people who are predisposed to substance use disorder, like myself, I can't learn moderation. That's just not a thing. The other problem is if I'm going to hold up one area of the world as being the romantic ideal of, substance of alcohol intake, it's not going to be the European Union, because the European Union not only has the highest alcohol intake as a whole in the entire world, it also has the largest percentage of deaths attributable to alcohol intake in the entire world. So there seems to be, and I'm all in on the romanticism. I cop to it in The Addiction Inoculation. Like, it's a thing to have this romantic ideal that you want to cling to. And that's how I raised my oldest kid. But then I learned what actually works to reduce my kid's risk for substance use disorder. And then I went to my younger kid, my daughter, and I said, look, I know your brother got to, have sips and have his own glass of wine and stuff like that, but as well as I do what the research says, because we talk about it all the time at dinner. So if I were to do anything other than have a consistent and clear message of no, not until it's legal for you, or not until your brain is done developing, that I would be saying, oh yeah, I know what the research says, but this is just easier for me, or I just really want to buy into this romantic ideal. And she would know that I was doing less than, I was doing something other than sort of best practices for what works for to lower her risk for substance use disorder.
You talk a lot about risk factors, and there can be genetic
Hmm.
risk factors, and that it's important to talk to your children about it, not just sweep
Hmm.
it under the rug. Explain that a little bit.
So I am an alcoholic myself. I have 9 years of recovery, and I was raised by a parent who has alcohol use disorder, and one of my parents was raised by a parent who had alcohol use disorder, and so on and so on and so on. And it's on my husband's side of the family as well. So my kids were born with a genetic predisposition for substance use disorder. And it looks like, that doesn't mean that they're going to have substance use disorder. It just means that they are at increased risk. And we think that genetics are about 50 to 60% of the risk picture. So I really don't have any ability to say, oh, no big deal, not my kids, and ignore it or brush it under the rug with that kind of thing. So we have to talk about it. And from my perspective, if my kids are at increased risk, we have to not only talk about, the risks of using and what it does to your brain. Adolescents' brains are different from adult brains. Adolescent use is more dangerous than adult use, that kind of stuff. But they need to know that they are more likely to slide into substance use disorder from regular sort of social use, and talk about what that feels like, what that looks like, what warning signs to look for. And they need to also specifically understand their individual risk, so not just the genetic risk, but for example, my younger child is not only born to someone with substance use disorder, has she's trans, and that raises her risk for substance use disorder. There's a whole bunch of individual risks that we have to talk about when it comes to that. So, for example, if my kids were really involved in some of the sports that are implicated as having the highest risks of substance use disorder, hockey, wrestling, lacrosse, and football, then we would have to have those conversations. By the way, you're spending most of your time around people that are at a much higher risk of substance use disorder than other people. So let's talk about that. Or if their friends were using, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think when we think about alcoholics, sometimes you can think like, okay, this person had a lot of trauma, but there's less obvious things that can be risk factors.
It's great. I'm so glad you said that, because yes, trauma is very much a part of the picture. If you want to understand more about trauma and substance use disorder, go read Gabor Mate's In the Realm of the Hungry Ghosts, or Nadine Burke Harris's The Deepest Well, about the impact of adverse childhood experiences on kids' risk for substance use disorder. There's fantastic books, but that's only part of the picture. But there's things like academic failure, social ostracism, not to mention the adverse childhood experiences like losing a parent, divorce and separation, an incarcerated parent, a parent who uses drugs and alcohol, that kind of stuff. And the cool thing about my getting to go out and speak to people about this is that I make it really clear that it's really important that we separate the shame and guilt from those risk factors. Like, I could wade in I could wallow in the guilt of the fact that I have raised my children's risk for substance use disorder in a bunch of different ways, by being who I am, by having the genes that I have, by moving right before my kids started high school and raising her risk of substance use disorder in that way. Or I can say, oh, these are my kids' risk factors. Let's target the prevention or sort of protections a little more accurately for my own kids. So, I'm never ever going to say, yes, separation and divorce is a risk factor for substance use disorder, but there is a huge sliding scale of how that can also be really beneficial to kids. If you're getting out of a bad relationship where abuse is happening, you're actually protecting your kids. So there's all this gray area where substance use disorder is concerned, and we need to be able to talk about it and not just feel guilty and shameful about it.
Well, I liked your metaphor in the book of the scale, or the scale of justice. And on
Mm-hmm.
one hand, you have the risk factors, and then you have the protective factors as the counterbalance. But how do you build up those protective factors then?
Well, and side note, I went to law school and never practiced, so I need to, use that knowledge somewhere, I suppose. The whole idea is, and they're really specific in the book. Like if your kid is, dealing with academic failure, and that's a really big risk factor for substance use disorder, then your protections are going to be things like intervention for that, finding out if they're dealing with a learning issue, getting them support around that learning issue, making sure that they have, a plan in place with their school. Whereas if your kid's risk factor is, separation or divorce, then you're going to have different ways of dealing with that. And then and knowing what substance use disorder or substance use prevention education they're getting in school. There's, only 57% of the schools in this country have any substance use prevention program. And of that 57%, only 10% are evidence-based. So knowing sort of what's available out there and taking advantage of what's out there, and there's so much more out there than we know about, and so many more allies available to us: school counselors, pediatricians, school nurses, all of these people that have a ton of resources available that we hardly ever tap into, because I don't tend to think of my kid's pediatrician as one of my allies in preventing substance use disorder, but they absolutely are.
Well, so there's all these commercials about like talk to your kids, but I think the greater question or the deeper issue there is how do you talk to your kids? Like
Yeah.
that's very specific and makes a
Yeah.
huge difference.
Yeah. And talking to our kids about this stuff doesn't start like in middle school. If we're starting in middle school, we're way behind the eight ball, because kids start using that's the average age of initiation is somewhere around 13.5. So we need to be thinking a lot sooner than that. And one of the things I learned from touring and doing a lot of speaking with The Gift of Failure, my first book, is that a lot of parents were like, yeah, but tell me exactly what to say. So in the addiction inoculation, there's a lot of scripts, because a friend of mine, Peggy Orenstein, she writes about sex ed with kids. She wrote two fantastic books, Boys and Sex and Girls and Sex. And she gets the same question all the time, like, yeah, but these are nerve-wracking, challenging conversations. So please just tell me what to say. And so she and I both, on it over and over again, we talk about the fact that these difficult conversations get easier the more we have them. And if we're having them starting young in a really age appropriate, developmentally appropriate way, they're actually not that as hard. They really do get easier the more often you have them. In fact, it's pretty common for us to talk about substance use in our home. We do it a lot. And, by comparison, I'm not as good as Peggy Orenstein about the sex conversations. Those still are hard for me because that's not my wheelhouse, and we don't have them as often as we have the substance use disorder questions.
Well, it sounds like for even you, that was kind of a progression of,
Yeah.
it's a little nerve-wracking to talk about, and now you're wearing t-shirts repping it.
Yeah, I have a wonderful shirt that I love that a friend of mine, Daniel Patterson, gave me, called that says "Normalize Recovery" on it. And yeah, I do try to. Plus, I'm up there on stage on a regular basis saying, "Hi, I'm Jess," and the reason I talk about this stuff is I'm an alcoholic. And I was in a school actually last week, and whenever I'm in a school talking to the students or teachers and parents, I give everyone my email address, and I get the coolest emails from kids. I was not at that school to talk about substance use disorder. I was there to talk about gift to failure, but I gave them my email and I said, feel free to email me about substance use disorder or substance use, or if you're worried about yourself or someone else. And my inbox just filled up with kids concerned about various aspects of addiction, substance use disorder, that kind of thing. So kids have lots and lots of questions, and I think it's just a matter of making that conversation more comfortable so that we can talk about these things. Or if you can't do it yourself as a parent, you feel like it's just not something you can do, making sure that they have someone they can talk to about it and get the right information from.
Mindfulness is really important for you.
Yeah.
And explain mindfulness. What are some good practices you can do with your children? And what if they just don't want to do it?
Yeah, so I think backing up, it's important to understand that, a lot of kids turn to drugs and alcohol because they're feeling feelings that are just really too much for them or too scary for them or just overwhelming. And as I highly recommend Dr. Dan Siegel's work on mindfulness, and he has books like Aware or Mindsight. Um, it's not so much that like I'm a big meditator or I expect my kids to be big meditators or big into mindfulness, but we do need to be talking to kids about the fact that their brains are not done developing, that what they're in the middle of is a period of their life when some feelings are going to be really big and really overwhelming because during adolescence, stress feels more stressful. It's just the way, because their brains, the upper brain part of their brain is not done developing and the lower brain part is more active. And so their amygdala is sort of on high alert all the time. So big feelings feel big and stressful and scary. And here are some ways that we can sort of manage those emotions or name those emotions so that we can deal with them. So partly that requires us modeling that for them. Yesterday I had a really bad day. It's just, it wasn't a great day. And it wasn't for any one particular reason, but I took time for myself in the afternoon to stretch and to sort of have some time alone and listen to a book I wanted to listen to in order to manage those feelings. So modeling that for kids, giving kids tools. I did, as I said, did diction inoculation, did ask my younger kid to do some mindfulness stuff with me, Dr. Dan Siegel's mindfulness exercises. And she found some she liked and some she didn't like. So, it's not so much that I'm expecting all kids to have a really dutiful daily mindfulness practice. We just need to be talking to kids about how their brain works, the fact that they have a lack of integration often until adolescence is finished and their brain's done developing. And here are some tools to help with that.
I think the hard thing for a lot of parents too is when you send your child to college, it's like a lot of partying going on in college.
Yeah.
And your brain's not done developing.
Yeah.
So don't smoke too much weed and give yourself brain damage,
I actually almost didn't even put a college chapter in the book because I thought, why bother? I'm sort of the generation, Animal House. That's what college is all about. Turns out that far fewer kids drink and use in college than the media, the movies, the media and lots of other things would sort of lead us to believe. And it turns out that it's really easy to predict based on your kid's interest, your kid's where they're going to live, what activities they're involved in. It's really, and their socioeconomic status and their ethnicity and whether or not they're on scholarship. There's so many ways to predict whether or not a kid is likely to be a big drinker or a big user in college, and then talk to your kids about those things. I'm not saying, there are very specific ways to reduce drug and alcohol use during college, and they're all manageable things that parents can talk to kids about. And I give scripts for that as well in the book, in the college chapter.
We covered a lot of ground in around 20 minutes. I wish we had like an hour and a half because there's so much to get into. Any closing thoughts?
I think a lot of parents are feeling like they're either starting too late or they just don't know where to start. And I think owning that we all start from a place of just wanting to do the right thing and just wanting to be the best parents we can be. And so if we go to our kids and we say, you know what, I think either I haven't been doing this right, or I'm a little behind the 8 ball on this, or I've been over parenting you, or I've been not giving you enough credit for being competent. And I learned some stuff and I want to do better. And so here's how I'm going to change. I think anytime we do that, we're modeling for them exactly what we would want to see from them, which is doing the best we can do based on the information we have. And if we learn to do better, then giving a mea culpa and moving on from a place of better information, trying to be the best we can be.
Well, thanks so much for being here today.
Of course, this was really fun.
Thank you, Jessica. The book was a great read. We appreciate you taking the time. This has been the Parental Compass by Family Education and Support Services. I'm Bobby Williams. We'll see you next week. Peace.